Hello, everyone. I think we just got the 3, 2, 1 go for our panel. Hopefully, folks are online and with us. I know this is a new streaming service for me, so hopefully, folks are figuring it out and are able to see us. I see Wesley is already in the chat letting us know where they're at. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Netroots Nation panel, The Trap of Domestic Terrorism, How Not to Fight White Supremacy. My name is Amira El-Subay, and I am the Deputy Director at Muslim Justice League. I will be moderating today's panel with Maisha and Celine. Muslim Justice League is a Boston-based grassroots organization, and our mission is to organize and advocate for communities whose rights are threatened under the national security state, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So as for the structure of today's panel, I will be asking a series of questions to both panelists. They're both going to respond to the questions, and towards the end of our panel, we will have a brief moment for Q&A, but want to encourage folks to drop questions in the chat as we go, and we will try our best to answer those questions throughout the panel. So as we're getting started, want to encourage folks to follow Wesley's lead here and introduce yourselves in the chat. Share your name, pronouns, your organization, where you are in the world, so we can get an idea of who is in the room. Cool. So let's get started. I want to acknowledge that today, actually 20 years ago today, was when the American war in Afghanistan began, with US-led airstrikes across the country. And this came just weeks after former President Bush announced the war on terror, and US police, military, security contractors, and think tanks found new ways to surveil, criminalize, and police us, knowing that under the guise of counterterrorism, anything goes. So in a room full of progressives, we know that racial and religious profiling, state surveillance, predictive policing, biased algorithms, censorship, all of these things are not only ineffective in preventing violence, they are always used to target Black, Indigenous, Muslim, and immigrant communities. And DHS's Countering Violent Extremism program, as well as the FBI's Black Identity Extremism, now racially motivated extremism programs, both institutionalize all of these practices under the pretext of fighting terrorism. So a central question to our discussion today is, given all of these values that we share, given all the things that we know about how these practices harm our communities, why are so many progressive groups willing to embrace CVE and domestic extremism legislation as a tool to fight white supremacist violence? We are blessed to be in this space today with two awesome organizers who are leading national campaigns against counterterrorism programs that were created to target Black and Muslim folks, but have impacted and continue to impact so many other communities. So this session is going to cover how CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, and its twin, Black Identity Extremism, function. We're going to talk about the historical roots of surveillance. We're going to talk about language and how it has impacted our communities, how it creates the foundation for these programs to grow. And we're going to share some updates on our organizing work on the ground and how folks can get plugged in. So with that, I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists, and then we'll get into the first question. So first, we have Maisha. She is the Campaign Strategies Director at Media Justice. She previously spent 2 years as the organization's National Director on the Criminal Justice and Technology team, where she oversaw the launch of the No Digital Prisons and Protect Black Dissent campaigns. Maisha also brings several years of organizing experience with her various national and local campaigns, including President Obama's re-election campaign, Fight for 15, and the Close Rikers campaign in New York. As the grandchild of a political prisoner, she is deeply committed to organizing people power that leads to radical, transformative change and justice. And next up, we have Celine, who is a Palestinian and Muslim community organizer based in California with the Palestinian Youth Movement. The Palestinian Youth Movement is a transnational grassroots movement of Palestinian and Arab youth who are organizing towards the liberation of our homelands, the right to return for refugees, and the dismantling of Zionism. Celine also works at the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights and is on the core team for the National StopCVE Coalition. So we got a powerful pair for you all today. And we wanted to start this panel by grounding ourselves in history and digging into some of the language that's embedded in these counterterrorism programs. So would love to hear from you both about how words like terrorist, extremist, and radical have been used to criminalize Black and Muslim communities throughout history. And if you can also shed a little light as to how we got to where we are now with CVE and BIE. So I'll pass to you to kick us off, Maisha.
All right. Thanks so much, Amira, for inviting me to this panel. I'm really excited to talk to everyone today. So I think it's really important to ground us in the history of the FBI and the history of surveillance in this country. So anyone familiar with the history of Black protests and activism knows that Black political power has always been seen as extremist and violent. When oppressed and marginalized people get together and organize and start demanding liberation, freedom, and justice to account for all the ways that they have been systematically oppressed, we are always seen as a threat. And one of the most infamous examples that I'm sure other folks will speak about or know about is the COINTEL program, which stood for Counterintelligence Program, that was used to infiltrate, discredit, and undermine the Black Power movement of the 1960s, along with all other political movements of its time, including, but not limited to, the anti-war movement, the Puerto Rican independence movement led by the Young Lords, the American Indian movement, and pretty much anyone they considered part of the radical left. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about the history of COINTELPRO is that when you get to learn more about it, you start to really realize how the FBI, in its origins, was created to criminalize Black and Brown people, immigrants, and political movements. J. Edgar Hoover, who was the mastermind behind COINTELPRO, in the early 1900s, went to the Department of Justice claiming that the United States was facing a national security threat from immigrants, from people of color, from the labor movement, from the Communist Party. And so, in large part, the FBI was created to really protect the interest of the status quo. So the earliest raids that were ever conducted were on political meetings, were on gatherings, and the strategies that they used from that infiltration just got replicated and evolved for the next movement. So the Marcus Garvey movement, and then the Civil Rights movement, and then the Black Power movement, so forth and so on. And you start to see, similar patterns and themes happening, right? There's the first step is identifying or labeling something as a threat, right? Then there's this element of psychological warfare and propaganda. Misinformation is spread, disinformation is spread to use to really label people's identities and their political activism as extremist, as radical, as a threat, which then justifies the institutional resources that need to be used to mitigate, quote unquote, that threat. So whether it's like the war on political movements or the war on drugs or the war on, quote unquote, terrorism, whenever our country claims to go to war, they're using some of these strategies, and it always involves using state violence to further entrench the power of the state to oppress and marginalize already vulnerable communities. And so that's kind of how we got to Black identity extremism today, right? Again, the concept has changed, but the terminology may be a little bit different. It might have been Black nationalists, it might have been Black separatists, it might have been whatever they were calling it before. But I don't think there's ever been a time in history where Black political activism and power wasn't seen as a threat. And so when there was that intelligence assessment that was leaked a couple of years ago on the quote unquote rise of Black identity extremism, it was a very predictable response to the movement for Black lives, for the current iteration of today's social justice movement. And we tend to like often frame this around police violence, but I want to broaden it out, right? Because our movements are doing incredible work. They're shutting down jails. They're reforming punitive drug laws. They're getting our people free, right? And so this is the state's response to that, is to identify activists as a threat. Specifically in the intelligence assessment, they say that in light of the uprisings and Ferguson, there is a rising level of quote unquote extremism within the Black community that's targeting law enforcement. It's very similar to how J. Edgar Hoover called the Black Panther Party the most serious threat to their national security, right? So the parallels are there, and I'm worried I've talked too long, so I'll stop there. But yeah, it's very much just repeating history and the same tactics over and over again.
Thank you so much, Maisha, for grounding us in that. I think you really touched on why it's so important for us to listen to the people who are impacted by these programs first, because we see how it impacts so many other communities, right? Like the systems that are developed to target and disrupt Black organizing then end up disrupting anti-war movements, environmental justice movements, all these other movements against white supremacy. So I really appreciate you grounding us in that. And yeah, Celine, would love to hear from you next.
Hi, can you all hear me? Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Marisha. That was really powerful grounding, and I can build on it a little. Like you said, has been a long timeline of U.S. history of criminalization, surveillance, and also pathologizing of Black and Muslim communities and their resistance and their political organizing. I can also mention a couple other examples of just historical surveillance operations. Like we saw in the 1970s, how the U.S. government deployed Operation Boulder under Nixon, which launched a large-scale federal investigation of Arab communities in the U.S. And basically led to an investigation of 150,000 Arabs using invasive and extremely discriminatory tactics, of course, in their investigations. And it was also intended to suppress and divide communities. So there's so many intentions with these types of programs, in addition to repressing and trying to stifle political organizing, also dividing communities. And we also know that, at least since 2002, police departments like NYPD have been profiling Muslims. They've been one of the main police departments at the forefront of developing surveillance and counterinsurgency tactics, of religious profiling of Muslims in New York City, developing tactics that other police departments have utilized. They've singled out and infiltrated mosques, Muslim-owned businesses, nonprofits, and have been entrapping and imprisoning members of our community, and really contributing to creating this culture of fear of not only getting politically involved, but even just being engaged in the community. They put out this report called Radicalization in the West, the quote-unquote homegrown threat, where they defined indicators of quote-unquote radicalization, such as wearing like traditional Islamic clothing or growing a beard or being involved with community issues. And these things become like precursors to countering violent extremism. And my father-in-law was one of those people who was approached actually by the FBI shortly after 9/11 in Denver, where he was asked to report on quote-unquote suspicious activity in his masjid. And he rejected the FBI multiple times and actually ended up having to move back to Sudan so that he wouldn't have to deal with that harassment anymore from the FBI. And he saw some of his friends actually get imprisoned through entrapment and just ridiculous charges. And we've also seen cases, for example, like the Holy Land 5 Foundation case, where five people actually are sitting in prison, falsely charged as quote-unquote terrorists, simply for sending donations to support hospitals or provide resources for orphans in Palestine. So all of these things are kind of precursors to what we're dealing with now, which is countering violent extremism and Biden's new domestic terrorism framework and strategy. And CVE, basically, what countering violent extremism is that it's a framework that basically outsources policing to community leaders, to social workers, educators, faith leaders, and public health providers to assist the government in surveilling individuals and organizations deemed to be at risk of becoming quote unquote violent extremists or radicals. And this policing and profiling is really also based in radicalization theory, which came out of Islamophobic and racist policies in Europe, and is really based on this debunked idea that there is a trajectory towards extremism that can be identifiable, and that there are indicators that can show us on that path to extremism. However, these risk factors and indicators of extremism include things like, again, being involved in your community or expressing political opinions that are critical of the United States or of policing or of capitalism. And the focus of these programs has undeniably been on Muslim, Black, refugee, immigrant, and indigenous communities in the US. And this theory also posits that increased religiosity and politicization of Muslims could lead to an increased threat of violence. So those things like religiosity and politicization would be these indicators for extremism. And the implications are that this opens the door for surveillance and legitimate by kind of saying that these basic everyday things could be indicators of extremism. It justifies the policing and surveillance of everyday life in our communities. And this debunked theory that has absolutely no scientific backing is the premise for countering violent extremism, again, which kind of outsources policing to other, to community members, basically, to report on each other. And this was actually rolled out by the Obama, there's basically a strategic implementation plan to prevent violent extremism that was rolled out by the Obama administration in 2011, where actually, basically under under the Obama administration, they had recognized that there was a lack of trust between Muslim communities and law enforcement. So they tried to establish instead this community level approach to deputize people in our community to do that surveillance and policing. And it's caused a lot of harm in our communities. And I'll read a quote from from an activist actually in Minneapolis who talked about the impact of countering violent extremism in her city. She says that the CVE program has caused immense harm to the communities it targets, from fear of biased targeting and unjust prosecution to stifling civic engagement. Young Somalis and their families continue to experience loss even after the program's end date. CVE has policed and criminalized Islam and Somaliness to the point that some young people are self-censoring to deflect targeting. CVE has eroded community trust by embedding law enforcement with nonprofit organizations, public agencies, and philanthropy. And it created a blueprint that continues to fuel similar initiatives under different names. So, the consequences of this across the board are that it gives law enforcement access to spaces that otherwise should be unavailable to them, such as spaces where we access services, spaces where we go we go to the mosque, we go to school, we go seek services, all of these spaces. It will expand the reach of law enforcement into those things. And it also expands the information sharing environment, which intensifies the relationship between, for example, the mental health sector, education, and law enforcement, and encourages information sharing and increased reporting. And again, like I said earlier, it deputizes service providers, teachers, faith leaders as proxy national security agents to take on that work of law enforcement to further expand the reach of the criminal legal system into our communities. So this framework of policing has been really insidious and also recently expanded through Biden's national strategy to combat domestic terrorism, which we can talk about in a bit too.
Wow.
Thank you so much, Celine. I feel like you both have really grounded us in disrupting this story that we're often told about surveillance, which is that if you have nothing to hide, there should be no problem with surveillance. And I think what y'all have really doubled down on is that these programs criminalize identities and fundamentally see Black folks, Muslim folks, because of their racial and religious identity, as threats to the state. So these programs create the space to criminalize everyday behaviors that our communities are doing, and create all these opportunities for our communities to be deported, incarcerated, policed, lose access to social services, all of these things that our communities deserve or no longer have access to because of the surveillance. So I want to
Mhm.
pass it back to Maisha to tell us a little bit more about how BIE does those things.
Yeah, Celine said something about there's no basis, like this stuff is not even, they don't even have proof of it. And that reminded me of, again, about what we learned in the Not So Intelligent Intelligence Assessment report that was leaked in 2017 about Black identity extremists. Even though by their own account, by their own leaks, that they say that there is no actual evidence for a Black identity extremist group, they still say that the threat is their top quote unquote counterterrorism domestic priority. They, essentially try to link together very isolated random incidents of violence that did happen towards law enforcement, but that was committed by Black people as evidence that there was this growing sort of extremist group within the Black community ever since Ferguson. And I remember in their report, they say, due to a perceived notion of racism and police brutality, as if like it's a notion that we are imagining, right? um has encouraged a certain kind of violence against law enforcement. And so again, like using a lot of racist narratives, baseless theories with no evidence, um to support creating these designations that we know are just going to criminalize our communities. Because once you've labeled, us as a threat, our identities or our political movements, now you've triggered basically all of these resources that can be used to surveil and monitor and criminalize people because they've been labeled as a threat. And, just because they conflate these terms, I know we're going to get to that in a second, doesn't mean that that surveillance disappears either, right? That's the sort of strategy, right, of changing the terminology over and over again over the years, is that it puts a different vocabulary to it, but it's really just the same practice of surveilling our communities. So, yeah, and unfortunately, with BIE, we really don't know a lot about how it's being used. What we've known is what we get from the leaks that happened in 2017 and then yet again the next summer. And so in response to these leaks, which also included not just BIE, but this program called Iron Fist, which we still don't know about. And I really encourage folks to like read and watch documentaries about how COINTELPRO got exposed, because people had to break into an FBI headquarter office to release that information. And so for us, we wanted to do the best that we could and use our resources to help uncover what exactly is BIE and what does that mean in terms of what resources are being allocated at the local level to surveil Black and Brown people. And so after we launched our Protect Black Dissent campaign in response to this designation, we also filed a lawsuit because after we filed our FOIA request, we still weren't getting the information that we needed to protect our communities. And in the course of that lawsuit, we've been receiving heavily redacted documents from the government about these terms. And one thing that we did figure out is that there are over 1 million responsive documents on these terminologies. More than a third of them are open investigations, right? So they're doing something, right? We just don't have all the details about how and what this looks like. But based again, Amira, what you said in the very beginning about our lived experiences, we know that this is connected to the narratives around riots and rebellion, right? Like we know that this is connected to the proliferation of surveillance tools like facial recognition, right? We know the elements of this. So even though we don't have exact proof, our history has taught us what to expect. So yeah, I just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much, Maisha and Celine, for getting us started in that way. And I think giving us a real understanding of what the impact is when we as progressives use words like terrorist and extremists, and how when our communities have that label applied to them, they lose virtually every civil and human right that they once had, right? The barrier for evidence is virtually gone. There's so much secrecy and information that can be held behind doors because someone has been labeled a terrorist, and therefore any kind due process is thrown out the window. Any kind of incarceration, deportation, all of these carceral punishment mechanisms are completely justified, and I think our community has seen that happen so many times over the past few decades. So now I want to shift us over to talking about white supremacy, and specifically how these programs have been situated as a solution to fighting white supremacist violence in the wake of the January 6th insurrection attack, when we're seeing not only Congress, but also progressive advocates advocating for an expansion of the national security apparatus to fight, to prevent things like the insurrection from happening again. We already saw Joe Biden consider new domestic terrorism legislation. Celine mentioned that funding has doubled for DHS's new version of CVE, now called CP3. And a main reason why these racist and Islamophobic programs are expanding is because they are being branded as our frontline defense against white supremacist violence. So, would love to hear more from both of you about what the consequences are for when we make public calls for increased domestic terrorism legislation, and more broadly, why these FBI and DHS and law enforcement programs aren't and will never be a solution to white supremacy. So, Celine, maybe you can get us started on that question. I hope she's not frozen. Oh no. Okay, Celine got kicked off, but I think she's gonna be back shortly. Maisha, do you want to start with that question?
Yeah, I want to start with how I feel when we use the terms terrorism to describe the attack at the Capitol. I get really worried, honestly, when people use those terms, because I don't think folks realize that they are police terms. I don't think we realize that when we use these terms, terrorism, extremism, that these terminology comes from policing. And so you're just justifying how the state talks about violence and crime, right? And then furthermore, I think it kind of, what's the word? The attack at the Capitol, yes, they were trying to disrupt the election, but they weren't necessarily trying to overthrow, right? Like, they wanted to preserve the status quo. They wanted to preserve white supremacy. They wanted to preserve making this country a violent and unsafe place for people of color, right? And so I think it's really important to be real about why people stormed the Capitol, right? And I think sometimes these terminologies, to me, I think distract people from telling the real truth and the real story behind how we really got to January 6th. And as far as why we can't use law enforcement to fight white supremacy, it goes back to what we were saying before, right? That law enforcement isn't really about public safety or crime. It's about maintaining social order. So given all that we know about the history of law enforcement, we really need to leave this idea behind that all we need to do is unconscious or implicit bias trainings, and now law enforcement is an equal. Like, that's not going to happen. Like, if you actually understand the role and history of policing, there's no amount of unconscious bias training that's going to uproot white supremacy from law enforcement. So once you agree on that, right, there's a lot of more conversation that can be had. But the other reason why we can't rely on law enforcement to fight white supremacy goes back to an example that comes to mind as how the intelligence assessment was leaked. It was leaked at the exact same time the Unite the Right rally was happening. And so while the FBI continues to claim that they are concerned or they recognize that there is a growing white supremacist movement happening, uh, while that is happening, they're actually disseminating articles and information and trainings about an imaginary threat around Black identity extremism. So I'm not sure why we would assume, right, that based off of their own accord, based off of the leaks that we've seen, that they would take seriously the threat of white supremacy and within law enforcement. And we can even go as recently as now, right? Like going back to what led up to January 6th, right? Many acts of violence happened from far right groups, whether it's about the election or vaccine mandates or mask policies, right? Like we saw a continued eruption all last year in the middle of a pandemic, right? And of course, right, law enforcement didn't take those actions seriously. So it's almost illogical to assume, right, that we can use law enforcement to confront and dismantle white supremacy. We need to abolish policing as we know it. We need to think about alternatives and new ways to really address our concerns around public safety, violence, and accountability. And then also a different strategy for uprooting white supremacy from our society. And the last thing that I'll say too about what had happened since we learned about BIE is that they conflated, they changed the terminology from Black identity extremism to racially motivated violent extremism to essentially collapse, right, their own internal, the expectation of their reporting, right, which basically collapsed the imaginary threat from Black activists with the very real threat of violence from white supremacists. So just making it harder for people like us to uncover more information about how much time and resources they are actually using to surveil Black activists, because now the terminology is racially motivated violent extremism, and that could mean kind of anything, right? So there's a lot of reasons why we cannot use law enforcement or these terms to eradicate white supremacy. Yeah, so I'll stop it right there.
Whew, that was so powerful. I think we could spend a lot of time talking about how the FBI shifted their terminology to encompass this kind of both sides narrative and changing it from Black identity extremism to racially motivated extremism, and totally creating this idea that there are two sides of violence. Like it is the policy equivalent of Donald Trump saying there are good people on both sides, right? That is what we are seeing in the practice of the FBI and DHS's policies. Celine, we'll pass to you next.
Hey everyone, I'm so sorry. I'm having some major tech issues, but thanks for bearing with me. Yeah, I'll just say that, again, like right after January 6th, when Biden labeled the rioters domestic terrorists, immediately we knew that this is just part of his long-stated intentions to enact new federal laws against quote-unquote domestic terrorism and to increase funding for things like countering violent extremism and policing and the national security apparatus in general. So again, like Maya was saying, these things are predictable. And it was also kind of ridiculous to see liberal supporters of Biden cheering these moves to use the surveillance and law enforcement and counterterrorism machinery to quote unquote fight white supremacy. Again, like you just outlined for us, this is all rooted in a legacy of policing and national security efforts to surveil and criminalize our communities and to also repress movements and political organizing. And we also did see, though, critical intervention too after January 6th of abolitionists and community organizations arguing that the inclusion of white supremacist violence into the category of terrorism and the use of counterterrorism programs to fight white supremacy will not provide any real protection for marginalized and racialized communities. This is only reinforcing and expanding the powers of the inherently white supremacist police state, and it will only inflict more violence on communities of color. So, in terms of the direct consequences of January 6th, during his presidential campaign, actually, Biden promised to end the Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Program, which was a new iteration of countering violent extremism. Instead, what he did was recycle the CVE framework to launch a national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, and CP3, or the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, which again is a new renamed iteration of CVE. And in the press release announcing CP3, the Department of Homeland Security highlighted the need for increased intelligence gathering and information sharing with law enforcement, specifically because of January 6th. So it literally justified the expansion of the national security apparatus. And we also saw, like, in the domestic violent extremism framework, anyone from environmentalists to anti-capitalists to Puerto Rican anti-colonial activists could be considered extremists. And again, like Maish was saying, there's the designation now of racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, which is, again, renaming the Black Identity Extremism designation. Of course, there's absolutely no mention of white supremacy as a structure or system, because part of the intent of all of this is to also individualize white supremacy. And I think that this is generally something that's central to counterinsurgency, right? Like the portrayal of the state as something that is neutral and rational. And in order to cultivate this like false veneer of legitimacy, especially after moments where we've seen the horrors of state violence and where they're like really exposed, the state, including law enforcement, will attempt to distance itself from the white supremacy that is in fact at the heart of the institution of the state and of policing, and try to portray itself as guarding the neutral center from the extremes of right-wing and left-wing violence or hate or terrorism or extremism. So it basically precludes the state from ever being accountable as a producer or enabler or a repressor of the context from which political violence from which political violence emerges. And equating right and left wing completely omits any kind of power analysis and portrays resistance to oppression as just a conflict between ideologies, or worse, like a debate between two sides, which is not the case. So this totally omits any power analysis. It tries to portray the state as neutral and not in fact white supremacist, and it individualizes white supremacy, which is not how we should be looking at white supremacy. And if we do look at white supremacy that way, we cannot fight it. Again, right, this framing directs our attention to the violence of individual actors. It doesn't portray them as a product of a white supremacist society, but it portrays them as these like exceptional or extreme individual racists, and continues to reinforce this idea that white supremacy is something that is just individualized or a sickness, again, which prevents us from being able to actively organize against it as something institutional and something systemic. And we saw that, like, as people called for the arrest of individuals who stormed the Capitol, for example, while also not calling for anything regarding the white supremacist institutions that are actually harming our people every day. It's still clear that this expansion of policing paradigms and this false narrative that the state is actually going after, white supremacists, is still intended to criminalize our communities, still intended to repress our political organizing. And no matter how they try to reframe it, it still only reinforces the concept of like radicalization. It still reinforces the surveillance and policing that we've been fighting. Again, it doesn't magically go away just because they say that now they're going to fight white supremacists. They're still reinforcing and saying that we still also need to fight all these other things, which is, repressing Black organizing, repressing Muslim, organizing and community building. I think, and it's also just a tactic in general to reframe countering violent extremism also so that our communities might be more accepting of it. Because when we've been fighting this, they really try to, I was on a panel at a conference recently, and someone, I think Kafia, who was a speaker on it, said that the state will try to mirror you or reflect you. And that's exactly what happens here, is that they'll look at our arguments, look at how we're fighting and what we're saying about these surveillance programs, and then they'll come back and say, oh, this is actually a community initiative, this is a public health initiative, this is not, actually this isn't targeting Muslims, now we're going to target white supremacists. But these are all just tactics to reinforce the exact same concept under different names to try to legitimize it further. So I'll just stop there.
Whew, wow. That was I hope people were taking notes on that. You just so eloquently explained that both sides narrative that we're seeing the consequences of the narratives that we're using in policy in real time. So thank you so much for making that so clear. Um, I really appreciated what you said about, individualizing white supremacy and the state creating distance as portraying themselves as a neutral actor solely as a witness to white supremacist violence rather than also an actor and a perpetrator of white supremacist violence. Um, so third question, final question, and then we'll try to get to a question from the audience. So please start/keep dropping questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to them. But now that we've situated ourselves in the history, understanding the impact of our language, understanding what the current landscape is in terms of counterterrorism policy in the U.S., want to hear from you both about the organizing work that's happening on the ground across the country to dismantle these systems and structures that are targeting our communities. So would love if you both can share organizing work that y'all are involved in right now, and if there are any action steps that people can take after this webinar to do their part in resisting these programs locally and nationally. So I'll pass to you, Maisha, to start us off.
Yeah, totally. So locally, I want to encourage folks to find their political homes locally, right? Local organizing is incredibly powerful and useful, and you have direct access to your representatives, to your communities, to organize around folks who are also impacted. So even though I'm representing Media Justice as a national organization, I just want to encourage folks who are listening to also find their political home locally, because before Media Justice, I was one of those organizers working locally on decarceration campaigns. And there's been an amazing movement around defund that, joined the movement, right? So that's one thing I wanted to just encourage folks, is to organize locally. Within Media Justice, through the Protect Black Dissent campaign, before the pandemic, we were bringing activists to DC to talk about their experiences with politicized surveillance in their communities, and to talk to their representatives about why it was so needed for them to take action. We have committees that have oversight or have jurisdiction over the FBI. They can investigate the FBI. They can call a hearing. They can demand the documents that we've been litigating around to share with the public, right? The sort of resources and the surveillance programs that they're using to criminalize dissent. So one thing you can do is join, our movements and join the calls to action that we've been holding down around our representatives to really hold the FBI accountable. Since since we've been in a pandemic, we've had to also shift the way that we organize and how we convene our folks. And after January 6th, folks might be aware of the anti-protest bills that have been emerging around the country. Again, another reason why we have to talk about white supremacy everywhere, and want to plus one to what Celine said about really challenging this individualized notion of actors of white supremacy, when it's our whole country and the institutions that are founded here that are entrenched in white supremacy. And after the attack at the Capitol, one of the most infamous bills was passed, HB 1 in Florida, where it deputizes vigilante violence against protesters who injure activists with their car. In some states, if you are charged for unlawful assembly, you cannot take public office. In other states, you will lose your benefits. So there is a very coordinated attack against Black and brown people, against activists standing up for liberation and justice in this country. And so in addition to the demands that we've been saying for the last few years around needing Congress to act, we've also started to host webinars and trainings with our allies like Color of Change around sort of the media and narrative disinformation that's happening to support the justification around surveilling activists in our movement. So I want to encourage folks to join us for a webinar coming up on October 20th on propaganda and how and how the media and the state use police trials as a kettling tool to frame the narrative around state violence. Exactly what Celine was saying. To further entrench their power and to further undermine the work that activists and organizers are doing on the ground. We will have more events and workshops in the future, but for right now, that's the one that's coming up really soon this month. So please follow, our work at Media Justice. I also have Twitter. We would love to see folks join our work. And then I think the other avenue of engagement that folks can do is join the fights, particularly around the surveillance tools as well. Media Justice has been a partner with the Athena Coalition that's focused on all the issues of Amazon. And the reason why we joined that coalition was because we were already engaged in state and local fights to ban the police use of facial recognition. And we joined that coalition because tech companies are behind the scenes actively trying to push regulations for these surveillance tools that, if you don't know, are racially biased, right? They cannot identify the faces of Black and Brown people, of women, of gender nonconforming or trans folks. So it's really digitizing stop and frisk in our communities. And leading to wrongful arrest. Amazon also has this surveillance home app called Ring, which we discovered earlier this year was used by the police in Los Angeles to surveil activists during the uprisings last summer. So there's also a whole movement happening around not just defund the police, but also remove their access to these surveillance tools that are being used in our communities, that are being passed off as, again, unbiased technology or a safer way to maintain public safety. So, yeah, those are just a couple of ways that people can get involved in this fight.
Thank you so much, Maisha. Celine.
Okay. Can you all hear me? All right. Yeah, so in terms of some local organizing that we're doing, yeah, I guess really want to echo what Maisha just said about also just finding your political home. And so locally with the Palestinian Youth Movement, we are organizing alongside community organizations like the Stop LAPD Spine Coalition, which is a local grassroots abolitionist organization, to actually resist the implementation of countering violent extremism in our schools, as well as in our communities. And, so like on a local level, we've seen how CVE is institutionalizing basically another arm of the school to prison pipeline by attempting to deputize teachers to report students or to criminalize students by reporting quote unquote suspicious activity. Again, that can include things as broad as expressing certain political opinions that are, again, critical of like the US foreign policy or being too involved in one's own culture, community, things like that. And the expansion of CVE in schools is, again, by no means an attempt to actually increase safety in schools. It's I really want to echo what Maisha also mentioned about really rethinking alternatives and thinking about how we define safety as communities, and what instead these types of programs really lead to are school disciplinary actions, including arrests or referral to law enforcement. And this would really majorly impact youth of color. It would affect their entire families. And so we're working with folks, students like Muslim students, youth, parents, to really build up, and teachers to really build up strategies against this. So we do have an ongoing campaign to kind of do some education around what this actually looks like in schools, and what this looks like in our communities, and how we can actually fight back. And we have this framing that we also share around building power, not paranoia, because we know that sometimes we also want to make sure that we're also empowering our communities and letting them know that actually silence does not keep us safe, and that we can organize together against these efforts by the DHS, by the FBI, and also by local law enforcement to surveil and criminalize our people. And so again, in terms of like what CVE can look like in education, it can look like a school starting like an after-school program with police to quote-unquote build trust between police and students. It can look like educators getting trained to look for indicators of extremism or radicalization in students, which again is completely unfounded and it has no scientific backing, like I mentioned earlier. And the point of this is to, really increase the development of, expand the reach of policing into schools and really expand referrals and information sharing between schools and law enforcement, which would end up criminalizing youth of color, expand the ability to criminalize youth of color in schools. I'll just give a quick example actually of like what we see in the UK. So we also have like an understanding of how this operates on a global level too. In the UK, there's the PREVENT program, which started 10 years before CVE was launched in the US. But in the UK, it's a national mandate, so everyone in the public sector is required to report using PREVENT indicators and guidelines. And we saw a case, for example, in a school where a 4-year-old was actually referred to law enforcement in the UK, and it's because the teacher thought he drew a bomb when really he was drawing his dad cutting him a cucumber. So this, this just shows that there's really no ground for referring students to things like PREVENT or CVE, and how it's actually training educators or other service providers, faith leaders to look at our own community members as potential national security threats or through a counterterrorism lens, and how that actually makes it possible for law enforcement to expand their reach. And and it's also a way, the impacts of this are just that, really can traumatize youth. It really can make them fearful of not only just, participating in the classroom or getting involved in their community, but just in general, even hesitating to access services for fear that they might be suspected of something like extremism. So it, again, ends up just really criminalizing and impacting our communities in a harmful way. And I also just last thing want to name the StopCVE National Coalition. So as Amira mentioned earlier, we're all part of also the StopCVE National Coalition, which has been building the campaign against CVE and the national security apparatus for years now, has been really working with a bunch of organizations that are organizing around this on a local level. And through the StopCVE National Coalition, which is spearheaded by the Muslim Justice League, we've organized various workshops, various educational events, political education materials, legislative and grassroots strategies to really combat the domestic terrorism framework, to really combat countering violent extremism and its iterations on local and national levels. So if you're interested in getting involved in the campaign against CVE, I'd really encourage you to reach out to the National StopCVE Coalition, or even just to learn more. We're trying to put together a workshop in the next few months too, just to delve more deeply into all of this. And I think in terms of organizing against CVE, some simple actions folks can take are, again, to reject the framework of domestic terrorism, reject CVE, call it what it is. White supremacy is institutional, it is systemic, it is not individual sentiment. And I think really also just supporting organizations that are fighting surveillance, that are fighting policing programs, criminalization, and who are offering resources and support for community members who are directly impacted by these things, by these programs and frameworks of policing.
Thank you, Celine. Okay, I'm hoping we can get to a question or two in the chat. And I'm wondering if we could get started with Maisha. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how folks, there's a question about what is the best thing to do as a young person when educating friends about the difference between systemic racism and internalized racism. And maybe that could also touch on the difference between systemic racism and interpersonal racism, which is something we've talked about in this panel, in terms of the individualization of white supremacist violence.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And frankly, what comes to mind is really reading. Political education is so important. When I started organizing, I got into this work because my grandfather was one of the longest held political prisoners in the state of New York after he was involved in the Panther Party in the 60s. And I was really fortunate to have a family where I had my education at school and then I had my education at home. And I worry sometimes that our movement today isn't spending enough time, like whether it's a book club, whether it's like a workshop, but just making sure you're creating a lot of space for your own political education, and then creating a space for the political education of your friends, family, so forth and so on. And I don't have a list of books off the top of my head right now, that you could read, but I mean, there's plenty. Mariam Kaba is a leader that has produced so many toolkits. I have the book "We Do This Till We Get Free" right in front of me. Then there are classic books like the autobiography of Assata Shakur, Malcolm X, Fannie Lou Hamer. Like, there are just so many books. And so for me, when I was, organizing as a young person, I think about how much time I just spent reading and listening and learning. And that is a really important first step to helping you understand the differences between systemic racism, interpersonal racism, internalized racism, which is really important. Bell Hooks is like another person I've looked up to in my life. Ain't I a Woman? So there's so much literature out there and so many people that have done this work before us that we're not starting from the ground up. So I really encourage you to read as much as possible and create spaces for you and other folks to learn as well.
Thank you, Maisha. I wanted to really quickly touch on one of the other questions on the chat about reforms to our national security apparatus. And I think, part of what we wanted to underscore in this panel is the need for us to actually shift our mindset from stopping white supremacy through the carceral system that currently exists and actually seeing this as an opportunity to uplift grassroots movements, right? And I think Maisha talked about getting involved in your local defund police campaign, learning more from abolitionist organizers who are talking about community-based alternatives to safety that don't rely on law enforcement. And I think another action step that all of us can do is think deeply about the language that we're using when we talk about white supremacist violence. Are we using the word terrorism? Are we using the word extremism? Are we perpetuating the idea that people who are criminals are therefore undeserving of basic human dignity and safety, right? And I think a lot of that is learning we can do from, people like Mariam Kaba and other Black abolitionist organizers that are doing that work right now and throughout history. Barbara, thank you, Barbara, for dropping in the chat the link to a Google form. I'm seeing Olivia says that it's not working. You might have to copy the text because it doesn't look like it's linking. But we would love to stay in touch with folks after this panel. Media Justice is running the Protect Black Dissent campaign. PYM and MJL are leading the StopCVE campaign. Both of our organizations often do workshops and teach-ins, whether that be for your community or your staff at your organization. We're happy to talk more about some of the questions we didn't get to today, and to find more options for folks getting involved in the coalitions that exist for both of these campaigns. But in the meantime, please follow us on social media, at Media Justice on Twitter, at StopCVE on all platforms. And that is the best way to keep getting updated information on our campaigns. And yeah, just want to wrap up by giving a huge, huge appreciation to Maisha and Celine, not only for their words on this panel, but also for the work that they do every single day to dismantle these systems that are targeting our people and to build real community safety in the process. So I feel very grateful to be in their company every day. And thank you everyone for joining this panel and for choosing us out of the many panels that you could have chosen. And hopefully people can get that link to stay involved. But otherwise, you can click our names as speakers and feel free to reach out to any of us directly. Thank you so much, everyone.